This is Romans 14 Unplugged, Feasts and Fasts and Food. Oh my. And we are now looking at verses 2 through 4 of Romans 14. What is the contrast between anything and vegetables? So let's turn now. Let me read real quick first the verses in question, just like we read them in the liturgy, but in case you didn't catch the liturgy, I'll read them again for you real quick. So Paul says in Romans 14 verse 2, in the English, this time I'll go English to Hebrew, English Greek. English says in verse 2, one person believes he may eat anything while the weak person eats only vegetables. And you can see on my page I've got the Greek. It says Hosmen pistue phagein pantaha de astenon lakante estie. Verse 3, let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. The Greek says, ha estion ton me estianta me esti exoteneto, ha de me estion ton estianta me krineto, hotheas gar auton praselabato. Verse 4 says, who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It's before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. Again in the Greek, su tis e ha krinon, alatrion, oikatein, ta idio kurio, steke e pepte, stat thesatai de dunate, that will be the reading. Those are the verses that we're going to be looking at. So let's turn now, and I've got some other tools pulled up just in case we need them. I've got the Bible Hub tool pulled up where we can look at certain morphology, what parts of speech, what cases the Greeks are in, and things like that if we need to, root words. I've got an interlinear pulled up here where we can actually see word for word stacked on top of one another, what is the Greek word and then what's the English word underneath or something like that. We can see that. But for now, let's pull up Verse by Verse Ministries. This is their website. You saw this last week. Their address is www.versebyverseministry, all one phrase there, .org. And you can see the address on my screen right now. And if you look over here on the near the right side of the page, they've got a study on the book of Romans right there. And they've even got audio podcasts. This is a great extra resource. I highly recommend it. Although it is not put together from what people would define as a pro-Torah or Messianic perspective where they are encouraging people to return to the Hebraic roots of their faith. Nevertheless, when it comes to well-rounded and well-established mainstream Christian theology, which includes the pillars of our faith and the foundations of our faith as believers, whether you're a traditional Christian or Messianic, well, then this website captures that concept. It carries that, and so it's a good resource. And plus, it seems to be professionally done. So they bill themselves as your number one source for free, in-depth Bible teaching, and they do a pretty good job. So let's turn now to their Roman study. I've already got this opened up. If you click on that link that I showed you earlier over in Romans, click on that. It'll take you to this page, which I've already opened. It's a PDF document that you can print out if you like. So let's pick up the reading where I left off last week. And this time we're going to read down through about 3 pages, if I remember, 3 or 4 pages. So I won't stop and comment unless I absolutely need to. Most of it's self-explanatory. Listen to the way they talk about the socio-religious dynamic that Paul had to deal with in the first century, particularly some of the stressors that were being brought up as a result of 2 faith communities being thrust together under the banner of Messiah. And so we've got traditional Jews in Paul's day who come from a background of Hebraic lifestyle and things like that. And then we've got Gentile Christians who are coming in and they're being brought together, and they need to work out their differences when it comes to, say, traditions and family practices and what are definitions of idolatry and clean and unclean. And remember, we talked about last week, and then we'll get started. Table fellowship is paramount in Paul's day and still within Judaism today. Table fellowship bespeaks of a shared agreement or shared relationship with one another at a covenant level. So much so that if you're sharing food with a person across the table from you, it's an agreement that you're sharing in the value systems and the belief systems, and perhaps even, and most importantly, you're sharing in the affirmation of the one God or the many gods, depending on the situation, of the person across the table. So if you eat with believers, then you're saying that I too believe in the one God that you believe in. I believe in the Messiah that you believe in, or at least I'm espousing to that. That's what the expression of table fellowship represents. I'm sharing in the food, we're sharing in the wine, we're sharing in the blessings, we're sharing in the fellowship. On the opposite side of the street, on the pagan side of the house, we could have the same thing going on. If you're eating the food offered up to idols and you're sharing in those ceremonies, then you're in essence saying that I subscribe to, I espouse to idolatry and demon worship and pantheon of gods and all the other stuff. So where you eat and what you eat says more than just sitting down and putting food into your mouth. So that's the background behind what we're looking at. So let's look at verse by verse ministries. I'll read down through this and then we'll close down Romans 14 and turn to the Shema study. All right, starting right here where you can see it highlighted on my screen right now. Chapter 14 opens with Paul calling for one group within the body to accept or receive one another. As we'll see from the context of Paul's instructions, the first group are Gentile believers, while the second group are Jewish believers. Once again, this is the traditional Christian perspective of who the two groups are, the weak and the strong. I disagree. I think that the first group are Gentile believers and Jewish believers, the strong. But I think the second group are Jewish non-believers, so the non-Christian Jews, meaning they're still weighing the possibility of Jesus being the Messiah, but they're part of the greater faith community that Paul would have recognized in his day. Indeed, we still should recognize because God has not given up on his people, Israel. Therefore, they are still part of a faith community that we recognize, albeit from a larger or from a distanced level as Christians, from a, maybe not right up close, but if we zoom out using that Google Maps analogy again, Jewish people are still part of the same faith community when it comes to monotheistic sons of Abraham, believing in the scriptures of Israel as truth, carrying truth, things like that. That's part of the same faith community that we as Christians should claim as our very own. They continue. Paul is asking Gentiles in the church to accept or receive Jewish believers into fellowship. He wants Gentiles to show Jews love despite their odd and potentially divisive cultural differences. He'll ask the same thing in reverse in chapter 15. But for now, we're looking at Gentiles accepting the strange, restrictive practices of Jewish believers. Let's keep reading. Paul refers to the Jewish believers as those weak in faith. Again, I disagree. I think that Paul's referring to the non-Christ believing Jews as weak in faith. And the weakness is an indicator of their not yet having decided that Jesus is the Messiah that they are hoping and waiting for. They have a messianic hope and an expectation, and they certainly have a faith in God, and they have a loyalty to Torah. So they have a heart to want to know truth. They just haven't reached that decision mode yet, and therefore being part of the synagogue community that Paul is addressing, or part of the church group communities that Paul is addressing, where his letters carrying some amount of weight, whether it be one side or the other, we have to realize that his letters carrying an amount of influence there. Paul does want the Gentile believers and the Jewish believers, such as himself, the Messianic Jews of the group, he wants them to have an evangelistic approach when it comes to those Jews particularly who have not yet decided who Jesus is in the scope of salvation history. Verse by verse ministries continues. To be weak in this context is not pejorative. They go on to say, Paul is speaking in spiritual terms, in the sense of spiritual strength and maturity. And their analogy is, in physical terms, it would be similar to referring to a 3-year-old toddler as weak in comparison to a teenager. When we call a toddler weak compared to a teenager, we're not insulting the toddler. We're simply describing the obvious differences between the two. A teenager has grown and matured enough to lift heavy objects, while a toddler is not yet capable of doing the same. So, naturally, we don't expect the same things of the toddler that we might of a teenager. Their point is, Paul is asking the church to be similarly understanding for those who are weak spiritually. Paul describes Jewish believers as weak in faith in the sense that they felt a need to continue observing aspects of the law. Here's again where I have a point of disagreement with the traditional Christian sentiments as expressed by verse ministries. I don't believe that Paul would have interpreted a continuing of observances of the Torah as an indicator of weakness. To be sure, Paul himself, by his own confession, was a lifelong Torah observant Jew. And Paul also recognized many other Jewish people in his day, for instance, Acts chapter 21, where Jews are said to believe in Jesus as the Messiah, so they're not weak, but they have also remained zealous for the Torah. And so, thus, in accordance with what we read about in the Torah itself and in the prophets later on, Israel was commanded by God to stay loyal to the Torah. And indeed, the prophets foretold of one day in the future, in Israel's future, when Israel would be filled with the Spirit of God to the point that she would be able to obey the Torah from the inside out, rather than just doing it kind of superficially from the outside. So, either way you slice it, whether you're doing it from a superficial way or whether you're actually doing it motivated by a heart that's turned to God and to his Messiah, like Paul was, Torah observance is a feature of one's life as a believer, certainly as a believing Jew. And so all of that to say that Paul categorizing keeping Torah as a sign of weakness is highly improbable, highly unlikely, implausible. Not a very good way to interpret this passage. But verse by ministries continues. We'll start right here, somewhere around there. By grace, Jewish believers were as free from the Mosaic law as Gentile believers were. Yet, many Jews found this transition too big of a leap to make right away. They felt uneasy abandoning their previous convictions so abruptly. So, they tended to maintain Jewish dietary restrictions for a time, if not forever. This was a sign of weakness in faith, in the sense that it meant that they were not strong enough spiritually to take advantage of the liberty they had in Christ. So notice what I like to say is the decidedly Gentile Christian way of approaching this passage, where as Gentile Christians, we start with the presupposition, which is a form of a hermeneutic, kind of like a scriptural bias is what I mean by a hermeneutic. A bias that assumes that the law has been relaxed by Paul and set aside by Jesus doing it, right? He fulfilled it, so we don't have to do it anymore. And therefore, with that assumption, we can naturally read the weakness as a weakness for wanting to keep Torah as a believer. And it suits the theology of standard Christianity down through the ages to set aside the Torah of Moshe in favor of what we might term a law-free gospel, where Paul is teaching Gentiles that they no longer have to concern themselves with keeping the law. Of course, this, again, runs counter to the overall message of the Bible, both from the Old Testament and the New Testament perspectives, because we're misunderstanding what he means by under the law and works of the law and things like that. But at the same time, it does a great amount of damage to the prophecies that Israel is holding dear, and that we Christians should hold dear as well. Israel's promise one day that God would fill them with his Spirit, take out the heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh. And in doing so, corporate Israel would turn into the Torah of God rather than turning away from the Torah of God. So we've got to keep that in view when we're reading through passages such as this. So let's keep reading down through verse by verse ministries. They say here, they felt more comfortable in the old ways even as they walked in the grace of the new covenant. Their conscience was still growing in its appreciation of liberty. So the word liberty here is seen in Gentile Christian interpretation here as a liberty from the Torah, as opposed to a liberty from sin. Right? There are two types of freedoms that Paul, at least two, there's more than that, but at least two main ones for my discussion tonight that Paul brings up in his letters over and over again. There's the freedom from sin and its bondage and its repercussions, well, not necessarily its repercussions, but its spiritual repercussions, as in spiritual death. That's what I mean by those repercussions. So we're free from the bondage of sin and the proclivity to sin because we're given a new nature, like that of Messiah, so that with the help of the Holy Spirit, we're empowered to turn away from sin as we discipline ourselves to avail ourselves of the Holy Spirit and the Word. That's one type of freedom that Paul talks about. But to say that we're free from the Torah, free from the obligation to keep the Torah, that's not a freedom that Paul discusses in his letter. What he does talk about is a freedom from the nationalistic perversion of Torah, what we might term a legalism, where we think that we have to keep the Torah so that we can be saved or be counted as more righteous in God's sight or earn brownie points in God's favor or something to that effect. That is a freedom that we are free from. That is a liberty that we need to celebrate. Verse by verse ministries continues. In the meantime, they relied on the familiarity and safety of what they understood in the law. Let's continue reading. Of course, they say, Gentile believers had no trouble embracing the liberty they enjoyed in the new covenant. Why? Because Gentiles had never been under the law, so the law held no attraction for them, especially in light of grace. There's a little bit of truth to that, right? Gentiles didn't come from a perspective of law keeping, of the heritage that Israel enjoyed, so thus it was easier for them to not get hung up on all of the legalistic strictures, the minutia of the Judaisms of Paul's days, the works of the law, and the things like that. Verse by verse ministries continues. For that same reason, speaking of the Gentiles, they looked down on those Jewish believers who could not set the law aside like the Gentiles were. Again, we're working from the traditional Christian perspective, which I have some agreement with and some disagreement, right? I've got a little bit of cognitive dissonance going on because I read through some of it and I'm thinking, okay, some of this is accurate, but some of this isn't quite right from an historic perspective. I mean, the Gentiles were looking down on the Jewish people who they felt couldn't quite get free from the law, or free from the Jewishness. And so part of that is historically true. In fact, we still have some of that going on today. So verse by verse ministry says, some, speaking of the Gentiles, the Christians, some probably mocked or rejected those weaker believers. Or even worse, the Gentile believers might have forced the issue by pressuring Jewish believers to go against their conscience. They go on to say, Paul says that the loving way for Gentiles to accommodate Jewish believers was to accept them into the body unconditionally, welcome them despite their continuing observance of dietary laws. And they say, and importantly, Paul adds in verse 1 that Gentiles weren't to accept Jews merely for the purpose of passing judgment. To accept someone for the purpose of passing judgment means to bring them under false pretense, and we don't want that. We act as if we received them when in reality we won't truly accept them unless and until they conform to our desires. That's not true acceptance and is certainly not loving. They go on to say, nevertheless, Paul acknowledges that Jewish dependency on the law was not desirable. Let me read that again, because it just shocks me. Nevertheless, Paul acknowledges that Jewish dependence on the law was not desirable. Again, when you read a sentiment such as that, I'm not just picking on verse-by-verse ministries because this is something that is echoed from pulpit to pulpit around the world in traditional Christian settings. The idea that Paul saw law-keeping as something that was not desirable or something that was not favorable or something that was a sign of weakness. How could this be in light of the prophecies that we find where Israel's told that God would bring them into a relationship of filling them with the Spirit, which of course is a Messianic relationship, right? An acceptance of their Son, of God's Son, Messiah, Yeshua, and yet those passages go on to talk about Israel accepting the yoke of Torah in a more dedicated fashion, not a weakened fashion. So something's not right with the interpretation that we're reading here. They go on to say, he was calling for acceptance of Jews, but only for the purpose of unity, not for the purpose of adopting their theology, as if their theology is an indication of the Torah being for Jews only. This is where we again run adrift of keeping ourselves grounded in what the Bible teaches us concerning the instructions of God. If we read the Bible from Genesis all the way through maps with the idea that there's one people of God that's brought out of sin and into a relationship with God, whether you be Jew or Gentile, and that to this one people group of God, there are given one set of instructions of standards of right and wrong, righteous and unrighteous, then we can begin to understand that the Torah is not a document that was ever meant for Israel only. It was never meant for Jews only. When I say Israel there, I mean covenant Israel. It's a covenant document. It's a marriage contract between two marriage parties, bride and groom, God being the groom and the church being the bride, the body of Messiah. So it is our blueprint for living. It is our blueprint for sanctification. And the Holy Spirit is the one who's going to help us get through that sanctification process. Nevertheless, the point I'm trying to make is that Torah is not a Jewish-only document. So let's keep reading. Paul was not endorsing a believer's need to observe Jewish dietary restrictions. I disagree with that. Dietary restrictions came about as a part of law part of a law God gave to Israel to serve as a temporary custodian. Again, this is under the rubrics of the Torah is for Israel only or the Torah is for Jews only, and it's temporary. Two of the main reasons why traditional Christianity doesn't embrace the Torah observance as seen through the lens of Messianic Judaism or even traditional Judaism. And the two main pillars are it's for Jews only and or it was done away with. Those are the two main pillars that I find in my dialogue with Christians. They go on to say it served to separate Israel from the rest of the nations, maintaining their uniqueness and identity. And then they go on to remind us about Galatians and Paul expressing it this way. They got two verses. Galatians 3:19, three verses, Why then the law was added because of transgressions having been obtained through angels by the agency of a mediator until the seed would come to whom the promise had been made. Galatians 3:23, but before faith came, we were kept in custody under the law, being shut up to the faith which was later to be revealed. And then the very next verse in Galatians 3:24, therefore the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ so that we may be justified by faith. Their comments on those verses are, God added to Israel the law to help address mankind's sins. It was ordained until the Messiah seed would come. The word until makes clear that the law was intended to be a temporary accommodation. Paul calls the law a custodian, a tutor, like a babysitter, keeping God's people safe until the parent came to claim the child. So, they go on to say, any Jewish believer who understood this truth possessed spiritual strength in comparison to other Jewish believers who didn't. The strength of their faith was evidenced in their willingness to set aside dietary restrictions that no longer applied. Those stronger Jewish Christians were willing to eat anything freely, but those who were weak in regard to these truths will eat vegetables only. Let's keep reading. Oops, sorry about that. Of course, Gentiles never had such restrictions, so it was easy for them to look down on any weak Jew, but Paul says that was wrong. I agree with that part, at least most of that. Interestingly, the Mosaic law didn't require Jews to eat only vegetables. Yeah, I agree with that as well. So why did this become the practice for those Jews who were weak in faith? Most likely the Jewish believers living around Gentiles were eating vegetables only to avoid eating anything unclean. I agree with that aspect as well. There are no unclean vegetables in the Mosaic law, and I agree with that as well. And I think, how far do I want to read? We were almost done here. It's another page. They go on to say, fresh fruits, vegetables, and grains are in their natural, unprocessed state kosher. That is to say, fit for eating. But if vegetables are combined with dairy or meat or cooked in pots that have also been used to cook dairy and meat, then they take on the properties of these other foods. So the fact that Jews felt they could only eat vegetables tells us something about the weakness of their faith. But it also suggests Gentile believers were showing no consideration for their Jewish brothers or sisters. They gave no thought to how pots and dishes were used in the preparation of food for the gathering. They may have prepared pork or shellfish or other unclean foods and thought nothing of how it would offend their Jewish brothers and sisters. There's a general principle being explained here, and I agree with the general principle of considering the other person and being aware and sensitive to the other person's own sensitivities. And I agree with that general principle here, so don't misunderstand the tone of how I'm reading this. They go on to say, and therefore Jewish believers probably felt they had no choice but to resort to vegetarianism to avoid eating unclean food. So, ironically, who had the weaker faith? The Jews who couldn't abandon the law, or the Gentiles who couldn't show consideration for their weak neighbors? That's a very challenging statement, and I like that. They go on to say, both issues needed to be addressed to promote unity in the body, and together they form two key principles that still apply today. First, we find the principle that we must endeavor to grow in our appreciation of relationships with Christ. Again, I agree with most of these traditional Christian sentiments that are being expressed from this point on in their commentary. It is important to avoid unduly burdening others in the body with our spiritual weaknesses. Everyone has weakness, and the body is here to help us. But that places us under obligation to avail ourselves of that support so that we may grow out of that dependence. Secondly, we must be prepared to accept weaker members of the body without passing judgment. We expect them to grow in maturity and time, but in the meantime, we give them grace and patience. And then we're almost done. Because in order for spiritual growth to happen, they first must be part of the body where they can be trained and encouraged, which is why in verse 3 Paul says that one in faith must eat cannot show contempt for those who lack the faith to eat all things. Likewise, those who observed dietary restrictions were not to judge those who ate freely. Instead, each group must recognize that God has accepted the other already on the basis of Christ's sacrifice. The general principle I agree with, although there are some specific specifics that I might disagree with. They continue, our faith in Jesus Christ puts to rest these differences because Christ triumphed in all things on our behalf. There's a kind of a Gentile whitewashing of the text that unfortunately doesn't sit well with many Messianic Jews, where we just take the text and in Messiah we erase all of the what we might deem Jewish distinctives or Hebraic distinctives, and in the end we end up with a kind of a law-free gospel, a Gentilized version of what Israel was expecting, God was expecting Israel to do, meaning let's just wash out all of the ceremony and all of the civil aspects, and let's just retain all of the moral aspects, and that's good enough for us. And that doesn't sit well with many Messianics, myself included. So let's keep reading. We're almost done. For the Jew, Christ kept the old covenant law perfectly so that his perfection could be credited to the Jews' account by faith. This is just another way of saying we as Gentile Christians don't have to keep the Mosaic law because Christ fulfilled it for us. His fulfilling of it replaced our obligation to have to do it later. And for the Gentile, Christ fulfills the Abrahamic covenant promise to bless all nations of people, bringing us righteousness apart from the law. Again, this is a clever way of saying that the law could never really save anyone, so therefore we don't have to do it anymore in order to just be counted somehow righteous before God. And then their last bullet point that I want to read, that you can see in yellow here, for both groups, Christ has paid the penalty for all sin, so that neither group finds its righteousness in works, whether eating or not eating. Again, the general principle behind the idea that the law is a legalistic tool that can bring a person into a right relationship with God, I firmly agree with and concur that the law was never designed to be used as some simplistic salvific tool that could bring you into right relationship with God. Therefore, I reject legalism. I reject the misuse of law. I reject any works righteousness, merit theology. I reject that soundly. And to the degree that a Christian outfit such as Verse by Verse Ministries is teaching that the law cannot save you, I agree with that theology. And I'm going to say amen every time when I hear that preaching. But historically, and I'll say this in closing, we need to remember that it's likely that the Jewish people of Paul's day, from a leadership and a learned perspective, weren't trying to wield the Torah that way anyway. There was a poison that infected their theology when it came to Torah, but it wasn't the poison of merit theology as simplistically caricatured by merit theology and works righteousness in the way that, say, Martin Luther and Gentile Christianity and Protestant evangelicalism describes merit theology and works righteousness and things like that. It was something a little different that I'm not going to talk about tonight. But that'll do it for the Romans 14 study. We'll stop here. 2 weeks from now, meaning we're going to take a break next week. We'll pick up our study the week after next. We'll pick up this Romans 14 passage, and we'll start looking at the Messianic perspective of these verses 2, 3, and 4. Okay?